And we're off. Good evening, everybody. It is good to see you all here. Thank you so much for being part of this. It means a lot to me to have you guys here, so I really do appreciate it. Obviously, as we talked about a little bit, this is part of my internship at Genesis and part of my education. But this is something I really wanted to do personally anyway, is be able to take what I've been learning, all of this stuff you see behind me, and try and distill it down into something that is useful for folks. So hopefully that's what we're going to have over the next 8 weeks or so. So the goal of these classes is to provide an overview of the biblical library. And I say that term very specifically because the Bible really is, as much as it is a singular unit, it is a collection of 66 other units, or at least that's the Protestant Bible. The Catholic Bible is 73. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But we do need to understand that the Bible sort of speaks in different voices, as the entire thing is, yes, spirit breathed and is inspired by God. There's also individuals, human writers behind all of these things. And that comes through, pardon me, each of the texts in different ways. And so we need to kind of hold both of those truths at the same time. But it really truly is something you need to consider both as a whole and as individual books as well. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through sections of the Bible. Next week, when we get into the first section, we'll talk about the Torah. We'll talk about the first 5 books. And how those function, because the idea here is, if you have an idea sort of at a 30,000-foot view of how these sections, how these different parts of the Bible work together, then as you read your way through them, you don't get stuck in things that you don't necessarily need to get stuck in, right? A lot of people will pick up a Bible, they'll start at Genesis, they'll get through Genesis. Man, there's some crazy stories in there, but okay, I can handle that. They get to the Exodus, they think, okay, the Exodus is kind of a fun, interesting story. I remember that movie, that was great, right? And then they hit Leviticus, and whoa, what is going on in Leviticus? And there's sacrifices, and there's building the temple, and there's all of these things. And a lot of people end up getting stuck there. So the idea is to teach you kind of a broad view of here's how these books fit together. And once you have that, then when you hit a spot in something like Leviticus that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, you understand the big picture of it. You can sort of skim over it and you can move on to the next thing. That's the goal. So what do you need to dive into? What do you need to skim? That's sort of what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. So each week, again, like we saw this week, you'll have a few chapters that I'd like you to read, and maybe another video to watch. I'll be doing some teaching here for the first 10 to 15 minutes or so. And the rest of the time is Q&A. The rest of the time really revolves around you. What did I say that inspired a question? When you're reading inspired questions, what do you want to know more about? And I won't guarantee that I'll have all the answers right at my fingertips, but we'll find them as we go along, and we'll make sure and get your questions answered together. Okay. So the other part of it that I do want to mention before we dig too far deeper into this is because this is something new and we're sort of putting it together as we go, we want a lot of feedback. So if there's something over the course of a evening that strikes you as, oh, hey, that was really good, or boy, that could have been better, please, by all means, positive, negative, whatever it is, I would love to have feedback and be able to make this thing better and better as we go along. Okay. So to start with tonight, we're going to have kind of an overview of the Bible. And there's 3 key things that I want to talk about tonight. And those are languages, versions, and literary styles. Okay. So we're going to start with languages. You'll hear Steve give Allie and I a bunch of garbage all the time about being language nerds and Bible nerds. And because part of seminary is they teach you the original languages. So the Bible was originally written in 3 different languages. In the Old Testament, most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The book of Daniel has a lot of Aramaic in it, and there are bits and pieces of Aramaic in other books. The New Testament was primarily written in Greek. And the reason that the New Testament was written in Greek is that at the time the New Testament was written, Greek was what they call the lingua franca of the Mediterranean area. Well, all that means is, like, you can go anywhere in the world now these days and pretty much be able to find somebody that knows how to speak English. English is the lingua franca of our time. At their time, it was Greek. Whatever language you were native to, if you went someplace in that Mediterranean area, you could pretty much find somebody that spoke Greek. And since they were interested in most of these texts being spread far and wide, they wrote in a language that as many people as possible could understand. Having said that, you don't need to know the languages to really get a good grasp of the Bible. I find them fascinating. I find digging into them fascinating. I've learned a lot more Greek than I have Hebrew, and I don't think I've learned any Aramaic at all. And there are a ton of resources out there if you do want to know more about the languages, really easy apps and websites that you can use to kind of brush up on that a little bit, or to learn from brand new. If anybody's interested in any of those things, let me know and I'll cue you into them. But the point of bringing up the fact that the languages exist, that the Bible was written in these original languages, is a couple of things. One, you will find Christian churches out there in the world that say that the only true version of the Bible is the King James version of the Bible, and there'll be preachers that'll pound on pulpits and say that. The Bible was not given to us in English. It just wasn't, and that's the truth of it. Whether it's King James or any other English translation, it was not given to us in there. So anytime we're reading the Bible and there's something in there that's confusing, or there's something in there that seems very, very simple, it's important to hold that loosely. It's important to understand that those English words that you're reading that seem like it's clear what they're trying to say, those aren't the original words, right? That's a translator's interpretation of the original words. And as translators translate, they bring all of their own personal theological biases, all the things that they've learned from their church and their upbringing, all of that comes with them into the translation, which is why you usually have translation teams. You have translation committees that create the translations, right? So that they try to weed out some of that bias to the degree that they can, but it's always going to be there. Anytime you're translating, there's some form of bias that's going to come along with it. So to look at any Bible and say, well, the Bible, God clearly said, because it says right here in this English, this is what it says, you got to be careful with that. You have to kind of hold, that's one of those truths you have to kind of hold loosely. I absolutely believe the Bible is inspired by God, full stop. I also don't think that the Spirit came down and whispered in each of their ears and told them exactly what words to write. I think God loves to work with humans in order to produce a product. And that's what the Bible is, which includes all of the fallibility and all of the goofiness that comes along with being a human being. The other point to understand is that Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic do not translate one-to-one to English. It's not like you can take a Greek sentence, put the English word over each of those Greek words, and have an understandable English sentence. They just don't work that way. Words have multiple meanings or different connotations depending on the context of the other words around them. And that the way that people who wrote in Greek and Hebrew understood grammar is far different than the way we understand grammar. And there are things like idiomatic expressions, right? Like the classic one we talk about in English all the time is it's raining cats and dogs. You go back a couple of 100 years and tell somebody that it's raining cats and dogs, they're going to look at you like, there's no cats or dogs falling from the sky. What are you talking about? So there are expressions like that were used in ancient times that were written into the Bible that when translated out into English don't strike you necessarily as idiomatic, but definitely are. So again, when you're translating, there's different ways of trying to interpret those types of expressions, or what exactly was the author trying to say, and how do I best put that in English or whatever language I'm translating into so that people can grasp the thought behind the words themselves. So again, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, those are the three original languages. And you just really need to know that any translation you're looking at is an interpretation of what those people were trying to get at. That all makes sense? Any questions there? We're all good? Okay. So the second point, that was original languages. Second point, we're going to talk about versions of the Bible. Why are there so many different versions? This entire shelf up behind me here are all Bibles. Some of those are duplicate versions, but most of them are different versions. Depending on how you define the word version, there have been around 900 different versions of the Bible in English alone over its existence. Right now, as we sit here this evening, there are about 100 different versions that are in use. Why in the world are there so many different versions of the Bible, right? Part of it's languages. We just talked about that a little bit. Part of it is when you start to do translating, reasonable, learned, educated people can look at the same sentence and disagree about what the point of that sentence actually was. Can this word that means multiple things, depending on the context, mean this, mean through, or because? It's the same word in Greek. but those are two different English words and two different English thoughts behind those words. So translators have a bunch of different tools to try and figure out what the author was trying to get at, but reasonable people can disagree. And as I said earlier, your own theology, your own bias, your own background will play a role in what you think the correct translation is. And now I think there's a new version of the NRSV that's coming out here soon. You have translators that are trying to correct for archaic languages, language that would be offensive now that wasn't offensive in the time, be it gender, be it sexuality, be it whatever it is. And so you can translate the Bible in such a way to speak to those issues as well. So there's 1,000 different things that kind of go into translating. But what you end up is with what I call or the translation spectrum. And so I'm going to share a picture with you guys here. And it's this picture right there. Okay, so you can see this double-headed arrow here. On the left where it says word for word, these translations, all of these guys down at the bottom in black are different forms of translations. There's something called a formal translation and a functional translation. The more word for word you try to be, the more you try to hone to that original language and get exactly the words that the author spoke. That's what's known as a formal translation, and that's what's represented over here on the left. A functional translation is where the author is trying to say, or where the translator is trying to say, here's what the author was actually trying to say, but I'm going to paraphrase it in such a way that it makes more sense to a modern reader. And that's represented over here on the right of that arrow. And then there's everything kind of in between. There are Bibles that try to strike a balance between formal and functional. There are Bibles that say, oh, no, I'm going fully formal. And there are other Bibles that say, no, I'm going fully functional. So at Genesis, you'll see us use the NRSV a lot. The NRSV is right here about 1/3 of the way to the left. It personally is probably my favorite translation. It's the one that I use the most. It does, to me, the best job of staying close to the original language without being so archaic that it becomes unintelligible. Again, that's a personal opinion. You'll also see us use the NIV, which is over here in the middle. And you'll also see us use the New Living Translation, the NLT, which is kind of over here to the right. And the Message pops up all the way. You'll see the Message is way over here to the right. The Message was a translation and really a paraphrase more than a translation, written by Eugene Peterson, who has passed away within the last few years. But Eugene Peterson honestly wanted to try and tell the story of the Bible in such a way that it was understandable without having to be connected to the actual original language. What was the story that a passage was trying to tell? Now I'm going to try and tell that in modern language. It's a really difficult thing to do, and it took him a long time to do it. But he's done it as well as anybody who's ever attempted to do it. So that's what a fully functional translation would look like. Way over here on the left, you'll see this interlinear. That's as literal a word for word as you can get. But if you read a word for word in English, it wouldn't make a ton of sense. But they created it so that folks could see, okay, this is what it would look like if we actually did that. I don't know that one has a ton of use, but it does exist. If you do want the absolute most formal translation possible, those do exist. So the bottom line is that when people ask about translations, the common question is, well, tell me what the best translation is. What's the best translation? There is no best translation. I hate to tell you, but there's no actual answer to that question, because each translation will give you different ideas and different thoughts and different ways of approaching things. Some do one thing particularly well, others do another thing particularly well. And so what we recommend is that when you're looking at a translation, find one that makes sense to you, that's easy enough for you to read and make sense of. Have that one. And then when you have that one, find one that's maybe a little bit more formal, and then find another one that's maybe a little bit more functional. And so that when you hit a spot where you're like, oh boy, I don't know if I like how that's phrased, or I don't know if I care for what they're trying to say here, go get your functional, go get your formal, and compare the passages, compare how they're written, and it will give you context, and it will give you nuance, and it will give you depth to what it is that you're reading. One of the easy ways to do that, I'm going to stop sharing this screen because I want to share another screen. One of the easiest ways to do that is at BibleGateway.com. I'm going to share that one with you here too. If I can find it. Here we go. So this is BibleGateway.com here. And you'll see that I have Genesis 1 pulled up in the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV. But what I can do at BibleGateway.com, this little guy over here that says add parallel, if I click on that, now I've got Genesis 1 in the NIV. Okay, but which is good, but I want a message version too. I want to go as functional as I can. So if I click it again, well, I definitely don't want the King James version, right? So, but if I hit this little down arrow here, now I have all the different versions at my fingertips, including the message. And now I can take that first passage of Genesis and I can read it through in the NRSV, I can read it through in the NIV, and I can read it through in the message. It's a super convenient way to look at all of those different things and then compare across the different versions and decide, okay, I'm not really sure what this means. So what's something that's maybe more formal or what's something that's maybe more functional to find your way through that. So highly, highly, highly recommend that. There is no best version. You can find the version that you're most comfortable with. You can find the version that works best for you. You can talk to people about why they prefer a certain version over another. And you'll get all kinds of different opinions, and those are great. But the thing is to not marry yourself to a version and say, this is the correct version, because there is no version that is the correct version. They're all interpretations. And when you understand that, it becomes a lot easier to hold loosely to something that's set in there and say, well, this isn't absolute set in stone. This is an interpretation. So let me go find out how it's interpreted over here. And let me find out how it's interpreted over there. And we get a lot more knowledge when we dig into things and try to decide how different people have interpreted them than we do if we just say, well, this is what the NRSV says, or this is what the King James says, and that's it. And that's all there is to it. So versions are important. Understanding why there are different versions are important, and understanding that you can't really hold too strongly, too tightly to any singular version is important. So that's the section on versions. Any questions there that you want to jump in with, or like I said, feel free to put a pin in it and we'll come back to it here in just a little bit. Jane has a question, and you can unmute yourself, I believe, Jane, if you'd like. Yeah. Go ahead.
Now or later, can you poke? I'm sure Bible Gateway has other features where you can poke stuff. And what am I trying to say? Like Jason has a study Bible, and it has all kinds of tiny print with helpful things that a person can't really read.
Yes.
Will you maybe later show how you do those similar things on Bible Gateway where I might be able to actually see it?
I will see. Yes.
But maybe later.
Yes, I can do that. And I think I know how to do that. So, yes, we will get to that. Thank you very much for asking that question. We will get to that after the recording. Anything else that anybody wanted to ask? Okay. So we're cruising along in time here. We talked about languages. We talked about versions. One other thing I want to talk about before we get to questions and answers, I want to talk about literature, types of literature, right? As I said earlier, the Bible is a library of books. In the Protestant Bible, there's 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. I promise there won't be a quiz on these numbers later. The Catholic Bible has 73 books. So they take the 66 that the Protestants have, and they add 7 books, which are referred to as the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical Books. Say that 10 times fast. Those are 7 books that were written after the Old Testament, but before the New Testament, that were absolutely read by people like the apostles, by the Pharisees, by the scribes in Jesus's time. But there was debates throughout all the time whether they actually rose to the level of scripture. And eventually the Catholic Church said, yep, we're going to count those as scripture. And then Martin Luther came along in the 1500s and said, nah, I don't think so. And the Protestants have not used them as scripture ever since. So again, a big library full of books, right? And within that library are a bunch of different types of genres, a bunch of different types of styles of writing. In the Bible, you can find examples of poetry. You can find examples of a narrative, a story type of book. You can find ancient biography or history. There's obviously letters. We see with all the epistles in the New Testament. And there's what's called apocalyptic literature. And that would be the book of Revelation, which is going to get its own week in this series, as well as a bunch of the book of Daniel, counts as apocalyptic literature. And the reason it's important, you don't have to know all the individual styles, down to the soup and nuts, but you have to understand that there are different styles, because you would read different things different ways, right? You wouldn't read Harry Potter the same way you would read a technical manual on how to fix your truck. Different styles of writing, different types of information that they're trying to impart, different ways that they're trying to impart that information. And it's the same thing with the Bible. You can't read apocalyptic literature word for word, literally, because Jesus never had a sword coming out of his mouth. But in Revelation, John writes that. Well, what is he trying to say? Well, it's a metaphor and it's symbolic, and it's apocalyptic literature is highly symbolic. So you read that differently than you would say read the Gospels, where they're talking about things that Jesus did, or Paul's letters, right? Paul's letters, obviously, you're going to read differently because Paul's letters are written to a certain group of people at a certain time in a certain place. And that background becomes very, very important to understanding what Paul's trying to say at various times. So you read all of these things differently. And as we go through, that's another reason to go through these as sections. As we go through each of these sections, we're going to talk about what's in each of those sections. For instance, there's two reasons that I had you read Genesis 1 and John 1 coming into tonight. And the first one is the obvious connection that they both start with the words in the beginning. Right? The first phrase, in fact, the way that they title the Old Testament books in Hebrew is often to use the first word or the first phrase. So in Hebrew, the book of Genesis would be called Bereshit. Bereshit is the Hebrew word that translates as in the beginning. So those words are very, very important. And when John writes in the beginning, John's writing in the beginning, knowing full well that as soon as he says those words, his readers are going to think back to Genesis, right? And what is Genesis? Well, Genesis contains the creation story, both on a cosmic level and as a nation, as a people of God, as a people of Israel level. So when John says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, he's immediately signaling we're talking about a creation story. Just in the same way Genesis was a creation story, we're going to be talking about another creation story here, a new creation, a new covenant, a new way of living. It's those kind of hyperlinks that jump out at people when you understand how these things kind of start to fit together. And it's those kind of things that I want to try and point out as we go through this series, because that changes how you view, as wonderful, as poetic as John's writing is, when you understand that those first words connect to the Genesis first words, there's a whole breadth of nuance and depth that comes out of those words, right? That's what we're trying to grab at. Now, the second reason that I had you read Genesis 1 specifically is there's the creation story, right? We understand, we've all heard the 7 days of creation. Well, first of all, if you were to go then and read Genesis 2, you'd find out there's a second creation story. So anytime somebody wants to come at you about the creation, the biblical story of creation, you have to ask them the obvious question, well, which one? Because there's two of them. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are different stories. They tell essentially the same ideas, but they tell it in very different ways. And scholars actually think that the story in Genesis 2 was written down prior to the story in Genesis 1, and it got ordered for various reasons, which I won't bore you with right now. These are all things to understand, right? But when we're looking at Genesis 1, if you look at the 6 days of creation, it seems to be a story. It seems to be a narrative. And there are those that would say it's absolutely a literal TikTok of here's how creation happened. TikTok, the ordering, not the app. Anyway. But here's why I would argue that there's a poetic element to it. Is if you take those 6 days of creation and put them into two columns. So column A has day 1, day 2, day 3. And column B has day 4, day 5, day 6. And you look at what's going on. They pair off exactly. Day 1, God creates light. Day 4, God's creating the sun and the moon, sources of light, right? Day 2, God separates the waters. In day 5, God creates the animals that fly in the air and swim in the sea. So that same separation occurs. The firmament, the dome, as the ancients viewed it, is mentioned in both of those. In day 3, 1, 2, 3, God's creating all the animals on the land. And in day 6 is when humans come into being, right? So you see immediately how these things start to pair up. That's not accidental. That's not just happenstance. That's not something somebody said, well, you could do it this way and work it. No, I think there's a poetic structure to it. There's a rhyme and there's a reason for how that works, which doesn't mean that there isn't truth. There's a tremendous amount of truth in that story. Is that literally how it happened? Is it literally over 6 24-hour days and then the 7th 24-hour day that rested? People have different opinions on that. I don't think so. I don't think so, because if the sun and the stars weren't created till like day 4, then how are we telling what 24 hours is, right? If the sun and the moon weren't created till then. And it does bring up an interesting question. If the sun and the moon, which we know are sources of light, weren't created, but light was created on day 1, those weren't created till day 4, what's the light that we're talking about on day 1? Because God does refer to it as day and night, but is there a metaphorical sense that we can look at it there? These are the kinds of things when we're putting together sermons, these are the kinds of questions that we ask, and these are the kinds of things that we dig into. And I think when you come to the Bible, if you bring those kinds of questions to it, you get a whole heck of a lot more out of it than just a straight reading. So I'm quickly moving past my time here. So I'm going to stop the recording. So for those of you watching, thank you for being with us. And then we'll move to our Q&A live.